gentlemen, thank you all very, very much for joining on this evening. My name's Sam Blight, and I'm General Counsel for CIRSA, which is the Colorado Intergovernmental Risk Sharing Agency, which is the town's insurance provider. First, want to start by saying thank you all very, very much for your public service on behalf of the community of Green Mountain Falls, and for joining up to be on a town board or commission. That's a laudable public service. Sometimes it's a tough job, sometimes it's a thankless job, but it's a job that's critically important to the success of your community and your municipal government, and we greatly appreciate everything you do on behalf of the town. So I am going to share my screen in a minute. Yeah, I think you all got in the meeting packet a copy of my PowerPoint slides that I'm going to run through as part of the training. But I do want to make our time together as useful to all of you as possible. So if you have questions as I go through the materials, feel free to raise your hand or wave your arms or put something in the chat to get my attention, and we'll certainly handle questions as we go along. And then Angie, if you could keep an eye on the chat feature, see if anything pops up that I'm not attending to, that would be great. Get a sense of who we have. So we have a trustee or two here, is that right? All right, how about planning commissioners? Planning commission, hi Todd, hi Lamar. Board of Adjustments?
We don't have anyone on Board of Adjustment just yet.
Parks, Trails, Recreation Advisory Board, hi all. And then the Fire Advisory Board. Person or two there. Okay, great. Very, very, very good. Let me go ahead and share my screen. This usually goes off without a hitch, but if it has a hitch of some kind, we'll get that fixed. So hold on one moment. All right. Can everyone see that pretty well? And enlarge it a little bit just to make it a little better. Okay. All right. So my training presentation for everyone is called Suggestions for Success for Municipal Officials. That's what you all are now, right? When you sign up to be a municipal official, you're now a government official, and we're going to talk about what that means. I included in my title a little bit more. I said Suggestions for Success and Avoiding the Risk of Liability for municipal officials. And of course, CIRSA, as your insurance provider, is interested in the risks issue and taking care of your insurance needs and helping you avoid risk and helping you resolve claims if you have those. But from where you sit as elected and appointed officials, I found in doing these trainings over the years that, if we focus our energy, our efforts, our resources on best practices for success, and that's really what my suggestions are, kind of best practices as to how to fulfill your role. Then following those suggestions for success are, the liability concerns by and large are just going to take care of themselves. So that's why I made the title the way I did. Let's focus on suggestions for being successful local government officials, and then all of our risk issues by and large will take care of themselves. Just to give you a quick overview, we're going to talk about the role of being a public official. You do take on a new role to the community when you become a government official. We're going to talk about transparency. The public sector is much different than the private sector, and you all as appointed government officials now are subject to some additional rules regarding the way we do things. We have to follow the Colorado Open Meetings Law that applies to public entities. I'll give you a little bit of information on the Colorado Public Records Law as well. It's critically important that in the public sphere, we commit ourselves to being transparent with our citizens and following the rules that apply. We're going to talk about running good meetings as a board. The dynamics that happen at your meeting are critically important to your success. We'll talk about how to organize the meeting, how to deal with citizens during the meetings, how to, kind of eyes up deal with any issues that you have amongst yourselves as board members in running good meetings. I'm going to touch very briefly on your ethical obligations. Now that you're government officials, you are subject to the Colorado Code of Ethics that sets rules for you all regarding ethical conduct in office as a public official. Then I'm going to talk about the town's structure. Every organization, large or small, has a structure. It's important both for the success of the organization and to reduce your risk and to reduce conflict and disruption, for everyone to understand the structure of the organization and how that ties into success and avoiding liability. And then finally, I'm going to touch real briefly just on some due process requirements for, in particular, the town board members, the planning commissioners, and the Board of Adjustment members, because they have some special job duties where they either make recommendations or decisions that affect people's protected property rights. And I'm going to talk about what that means, okay? Recognize that my presentation, though I'm an attorney, this is not legal advice. This is a training resource only. And I've got a pretty good radar for when we might be getting into something for which you need concrete legal advice from the town's own attorney. You know, I've got these radar that go up if somebody jumps on, unmutes and says, hey, Sam, I got a question about this. Could you tell me what if another member of the Board of Trustees, does this? And if it sounds to me like that was something that happened just yesterday, and this is kind of a live issue in the town for which you're really asking for legal advice, I'll still give you a thought or two, but it's important to understand that you'll need to look to your staff and your own attorney for legal advice on specific issues, okay? All right, let's talk about my suggestion. One for you all as appointed elected officials is no matter how long you've been with the town as a town official, maybe you just got appointed or maybe you've got a couple of terms of office under your belt, always remember the change in roles that you take on when you become a government official, right? You're no longer just a citizen of Green Mountain Falls. You're now in the eyes of your constituents, in the eyes of the community members that know, that you're on a town board. To them, you're a government official 24/7, right? Doesn't mean that you have to give up your private life when you're on a board or commission, but you do have to understand and appreciate that when people talk to you about goings on in the town, and particularly what's up with your board or commission, they are going to perceive what you say as being a spokesperson for the town. They're always going to view you as a public official. The other important piece there is to remember that your words and your actions will stick to you as a government official. So keep that in mind. It's quite difficult to take the hat off and say, I'm no longer a government official, but I'm going to talk about planning commission business when you're a planning commission member. It's not that easy. You'll always be perceived as being a member of that commission, and you have certain duties and obligations in that regard. Recognize also that as a town official now, you're no longer an outsider to town government, right? We're all now kind of the ultimate insiders, right? We're the ones that hold the power and authority of government. Our constituents know that. They have expectations of us, and we need to make sure we honor those. Make sure also that you understand that, maybe you got interested in being on a town board because you were a critic or a proponent of a particular issue. Maybe you were a proponent of improvements to the trail system. Or maybe you had the attitude of, well, I'd like to get appointed so I can help shake things up, or I think I can make improvements. Recognize those are all kind of outsider perspectives. And now that you're on a town board, it's your responsibility to be a good representative, right, of your board or your commission with regard to all the issues that come in front of your board or commission. So make that a hallmark of your tenure, and that'll serve you real well. All right, I don't think, the town board formally raises their right hand and they take an oath. I swear to uphold the Constitution and the laws of the state of Colorado and the ordinances of the town. I'm not sure if all you board members do that, but without doing it expressly, you implicitly do that, right? When you become a town official, you have agreed, right, to uphold and follow the applicable laws and rules that apply to being a government official. And when you do that, you make certain commitments, right? You commit that you will respect the role and responsibility you have in the town structure, right? We're going to talk about how everybody has a role, whether it's the elected officials, the appointed officials, the staff members, or even the volunteers who just help out, on a weekend project. Everybody's got their own designated roles and responsibilities. You also made a commitment to lawful conduct, right? You as a government official have committed to follow the town's rules and procedures and criteria in making decisions, including following the open meetings law and following the state ethics laws, et cetera. You also made a commitment to ethical practices. I'm going to explain just real briefly in a minute the conflict of interest rules that apply to you, so you have understanding of those. And then, this last bullet on this slide, maybe it doesn't sound like something that you would commit to in an oath of office, but this to me, I think, is one of the most important commitments that you make, right? Remember that we all get appointed as individuals to a board or commission that maybe has 5 members, right? But that board doesn't have 5 different voices. At the end of the day, that board's role within the organization is to speak with one voice. Sometimes, you're going to get there by a 3-2 vote. Other times it's going to be a unanimous vote, but the responsibility of the board and its board members is to do its work and ultimately come out with the one voice of the board. Boards, commissions, councils in the public sphere articulate the one voice. We all contribute to that through our discussions, our debate, our deliberations. But doesn't that mean, as part of this kind of oath, and when we got appointed, we made a commitment to each other, our fellow board members, to be courteous and respectful of each other's points of view, right? To have empathy for how people approach an issue and work together, at least in terms of articulating that one voice of our board or commission. Again, it doesn't particularly matter whether it's a unanimous 5-0 vote or a 3-2 vote, but we have to work with each other to express that one voice of the board. And I think that requires, in the simplest terms, kind of a working together attitude. Yes, you're going to work to bring people around to your way of looking at an issue, persuasion, right? Some debate and so on. But at the end of the day, we have to respect each other's divergent styles and viewpoints. Recognize that if you decide to get involved in town government because you were dissatisfied with something or had a certain view as a citizen, again, those are kind of outsider perspectives, right? And recognize now that you need to hold that insider's perspective. If a board or commission has a member or a couple of members who sort of don't honor that aspect, and they kind of approach the job thinking, well, I don't want to do that. That rule doesn't apply to me, or the rest of you can do what you want. I'm not going to do it. Those are kind of outsider perspectives that, in the worst case situation, can expose you to some liability risks, right? So be very careful of hanging on to that outsider perspective. And a board as a board needs to be attuned to that issue, right? If it has one of its own members who kind of takes a lone wolf approach or does things in a rogue fashion, particularly ones that can create some potential risk for you, then you need to have eyes up discussions about how do we resolve those situations, okay? Recognize also that holding on to an outsider perspective, that can kind of reduce your effectiveness, right? Recognize and embrace the concept that each one of us is part of a collective decision-making body, right? You look at your ordinance. I know you got a brand new ordinance that talks about the roles of the boards and commissions. And each board has 5 members, but it doesn't follow from that, that each of you hold 1/5 of the power, right? You're kind of thinking, well, the Parks and Trails Board's got 5 members and I got 1/5 of that power, and, doggone it, I'm going to go out and use that power. It doesn't work that way. If you look at your kind of charter document, you'll never see in there a provision that says, one member of the board has the authority to do this or that. That power that your board holds, whether it's to create a trail plan or a master plan, or to work on a fire mitigation plan, that's a power that's held by the board in total, and it can only be exercised by the board in total, right? So that must mean that success as an appointed official really happens through collaboration and consensus building. You know, I may be one member of the board and I may have an idea and a particular policy perspective. You know, I don't know, maybe it's, you know, let's just use an example. I'll say, well, not just picking one of you, not anyone in particular, but let's say I'm on the Parks and Trails Advisory Board, and my policy view is we ought to have restroom facilities at each and every trailhead. And I may be absolutely adamant about that. I may embrace that policy objective to the end of time, but if I can't bring, right, at least two other members of the board along with me, right, I'm not going to have success in that undertaking. Okay, so we have to think in terms of collaboration and consensus building. The flip side is also true. Like in my example, if I've talked to all the board members at a meeting and I've expressed with great passion my desire for this particular outcome, if the rest of the board says to me, you know, not a priority for us, not within our budget constraints, not something we want to pursue right now, then I have to, as that individual member, right, be cognizant of the point that I need to let that particular policy perspective go to the parking lot for now, right? It can be very destructive to the organization if you have policy perspectives that the board does not embrace, but you attempt to pursue those on your own. And that can be a bad dynamic for your group, right? So recognize that as government officials, part of your job duty is really delivering good governance on behalf of the community. And over my years of doing these trainings, I've kind of decided that good governance really depends upon good civics. And I've listed those principles, the main ones on the left-hand side of this slide. And I found that if you commit yourselves to good civics, the principles that I've listed in bold, then by and large, the related risk issues, legal issues that are in parentheses next to each item are going to take care of themselves. So by that, I mean, you know, commit yourselves to openness and transparency. And you're going to have few, if any, disputes or problems with the open meetings laws or the open records laws. Commit yourself to fundamental fairness, you know, to everyone who comes in front of you. Be fair to each other, be fair to staff, be fair to citizens. And that's a great place to be. And you're very rarely going to have anyone criticizing or attempting to take issue with your procedures. Be predictable in how you do things, particularly in the public sphere, right? It's not a great place to be an organization or a board where there's a vibe that they're an unpredictable group. Particularly if someone's in front of you with a particular request. This applies mainly to the Board of Adjustment, Town Board, and Planning Commission. But if you have applicants who come in front of you and the vibe they get is, well, you know, the rules, at least on paper, haven't changed, but now the board seems to be applying them differently, or they're interpreting the rules differently, or they're introducing new requirements that I never knew existed. Those are all recipes for disaster from a legal perspective. But as important, I think they greatly erode the trust that the community has in how we approach our business as a municipal government. So make sure you're predictable in things. That doesn't mean you can't change things, right? You absolutely, right? Boards that work on plans, you're going to revise plans, right? If you're one of the boards that makes land use recommendations or decisions, yeah, you're going to change the land use rules every once in a while. But make sure you do that through the proper procedures and don't do it in an unpredictable fashion. Then lastly, I think the biggest civics principle that leads to success is mutuality of respect. Mutual respect with each other as board members, with staff, with all the citizens that you interact with. Because here's kind of my practical example of that. I know that being a public official sometimes can be a lonely job and a tough job. And you're going to have some meetings every once in a while where it's going to get emotional, maybe even heated, and you're going to feel like you're under attack, right? But if people walk away from, and usually the reason those meetings happen is because there's a high profile issue on the agenda. You know, the substantive issue that's under consideration is important to people and they have passion about it, right? But if your citizens and you all go home from that process and your citizen says, you know what, I still disagree with the decision the board made, but you know what, now I get it. They had to take all that conflicting information and digest it and come up with a single recommendation or a single decision for the town. But you know what, I feel like I was heard. I feel like it was a good discussion process, right? And I feel like I was respected. That's an awesome place to be with your community. So make that a goal of how you do your business, and that'll serve you really well, okay? All right, unless there's any questions or thoughts on that, I'm gonna turn next to my second suggestion, which is honor transparency. Transparency is not, you know, any sort of legal word, but it's the buzzword of the day, right? And in its broadest sense, in the government sphere, it means being open and accessible, right, to your citizens regarding information. Your citizens do take a great interest in what's going on with the town. That includes every part of the organization, starting with the town board all the way through each and every board and commission. Citizens are interested, right, in what you're up to and what policy objectives you're pursuing and how you do business. So make sure you embrace that concept. If you don't believe me, do some things that are kind of close to the line or step over the line regarding transparency, right? You'll bear the brunt of some criticism there, right? If not potential legal challenges for non-compliance with the law. So the other thing is, you know, not every board meeting that you have is going to be a full house. Maybe you'll have only 1 or 2 citizens. Some nights you'll have no citizens there. Other nights you'll have a lot. But recognize citizens appreciate everything you do as an organization to be transparent, right? So if you as a board, within the resources that you have, can find ways to, you know, prepare things that can be put up on your website or send out little updates on the website of what your board's up to. That really helps your citizens because they can see and appreciate what's on your agenda, right? And keep an eye on things from their perspective, right? So commit yourselves to transparency and that'll serve you very well. All right. I want to dig a little bit into the actual details of some rules that apply to you, because this may be new to some of you, particularly those who are brand new to public service. So in Colorado, we have a statute called the Colorado Open Meetings Law, and it basically says that any meeting of 3 or more members of your board to discuss public business is a meeting that needs to be open to the public. So in the public sphere, it's not permissible, right, for 3 board members to meet in a private home, close the door, talk about the master plan they're working on, and not allow citizens to observe that discussion. That would be a violation of the statute, right? This open meetings law applies to the town board and all town boards or commissions. It does not matter that your board is, quote, simply advisory. And by the way, don't ever undersell yourselves on that point. An advisory board is critical to the policymaking process, right? In fact, in my experience, many policy boards do a lot of the heavy lifting, right, in getting a recommendation to the governing body, the city council or the town board, that has great weight. And that's exactly why a town board or a city council will create advisory boards and commissions, is because they're the folks who can drill down into issues and really develop a strong understanding of an issue to provide a recommendation that can go up to the Board of Trustees. So, but you must remember the principle that whenever 3 or more members of your board gather to discuss public business of your board, that has to be a meeting at which citizens can observe and be present for the meeting, okay? Additionally, if it's a meeting at which you're going to take some kind of action, right, then you need to post an agenda, and staff will usually take care of that for you, right? I'm seeing a smile or two, but that needs to be attended to. And these are very important principles because non-compliance with the statute, right, can expose both your board and the town to legal risk, including court proceeding for violation of the statute and award of attorney's fees against the town if you lose an open meetings case and those kinds of things. But as my earlier slide pointed out, failing to comply with the open meetings law, probably one of the most significant injuries is the injury to public trust, right? In how you do the public's business, okay? All right, so I mentioned that it applies to any kind of meeting to discuss public business. Recognize that under this statute, a meeting is any kind of gathering, whether in person, like we used to do before the pandemic when we meet at town hall, right? In person, by phone, or by electronic means of communication, just like this Zoom call, right? Or email, right? So the open meetings law can be triggered if 3 or more board members are getting on their computers and talking about their master plan or any other item of board business by email, right? So you don't want to do that. I kind of have a glib suggestion in that regard. If your board wants to have more discussions of an issue, then let's call an additional meeting, get the notice out, and have the discussion at a meeting, right? That ensures you comply with the open meetings law and kind of frees up your time on off meeting nights, because you should not, and under the law shall not, right, be having discussions by email of public business, okay? Let's see, the open meetings law, you kind of ask, well, is there ever a time when our board can have a private discussion? So the open meetings law does allow executive sessions, but only for a very limited number of topics and only after you follow very specific procedures. So do not have an executive session, right, unless and until you first consulted with staff, right, and you determine whether we can actually have an executive session, and you must follow very detailed legal procedures, which aren't here in this presentation, but are quite significant. For example, you have to make a motion that says what topic you're going to talk about. You have to recite a specific statute, and you have to give further detail, and there's a whole bunch more to that. So if you ever get the notion that we want to hold an executive session, do not do it unless and until staff, I assume Angie or Julia, that staff would have to be present for that to help guide the board through the procedures. Is that right?
Absolutely, and we are happy to do that.
Yeah. So don't have one without staff there to help you monitor and comply with the procedures. Okay. All right. A couple of exceptions to the open meetings law, just to let you know, it's not all consuming, but it is quite broad. The open meetings law does not apply to a purely social gathering, right? So if you're the board member who's going to host a barbecue and the other 4 members of your board are going to come, you're not in violation of the open meetings law for having that purely social event. But that barbecue cannot be a substitute for a public meeting, right? So you have to make sure that whether it's a social gathering or just like a chance meeting where you bump into each other in the coffee shop, you have to be sure that that does not become the place where you start talking about public business, because again, the requirement of the law is that citizens have a right to be present for that discussion, okay? Also, the open meetings law does not apply to one-on-one discussions. So accepting town board, planning commission, and quasi-judicial discussions for the Board of Adjustment for those 3 boards, it's okay to have a one-on-one discussion with a fellow board member. And I fully understand and appreciate that, you might need to talk to build relationships, to understand each other's philosophy and background and so on. And that's okay, right? But don't use the one-on-one technique in terms of being one-on-one and then another one-on-one and then another one-on-one, right? That's what we call a rolling quorum or a serial meeting. Don't let those one-on-one discussions become a substitute or a proxy for having a board meeting with all your members present to discuss public business. Imagine how it looks from your constituents' perspective, right? If you show up at your board meeting and there's a new item on the agenda that's never been discussed before, and it's called up for discussion, and somebody says, well, we talked about this quite a bit. What do you think the citizen's going to be thinking in their head, right? Well, where and when did those discussions occur, right? So don't leave your constituents with the sense that they're walking into the middle of a discussion that occurred somewhere else when it comes to public business of your board, okay? All right. I just put on the bottom of that slide, that last bullet. This is actually primarily for staff to keep attention to. You actually say under your local rules that a majority of the appointed non-vacant seats constitutes a quorum. So if you're on a 5-member board and you've got, 2 empty seats and only 3 people seated, then this open meetings law, could be triggered by a one-on-one discussion. So not to get too complicated, to kind of step back, my basic takeaway for you all is make sure that you have discussions of your board's business only in duly noticed public meetings, and that'll serve you well, okay? All right, here's some examples of ways you can get in trouble under the open meetings law. It's impermissible under the Colorado state law to, have a meeting before the meeting. You don't take you get the idea of, hey, you got a meeting tonight, let's meet at the, coffee shop an hour before and figure out how we're gonna do everything. That's a violation of state statute. It's also a violation of state law to call impromptu meetings of the group without notice, right, to take action or have discussions, okay? I've already talked about email. My final takeaway on all this is the 3rd bullet in this slide. Keep in mind, I find most telling, at the very beginning of the Colorado Open Meetings Law, there's a provision that says that it's the public policy of the state of Colorado that the formation of public policy is public business and shall not be conducted in secret. And I find the most telling word there to be formation, not the final vote, right? Not the final announcement that we've come to a decision that we discussed and reached somewhere else. The whole idea of the open meetings law is to give people a window into how policy is made. And to do that, you have to have your discussions in an open public forum, okay? Finally, with regard to open meeting stuff, make sure you don't subscribe to a parallel process. Embrace the process that you have. I know it can be seem cumbersome sometimes. Oh, we got to get a meeting together. We got to get the agenda posted. And we got to find a time when everybody can meet. But that's what public discourse is all about, right? Finding a time and place and a manner in which every interested party can show up and listen in to what you're doing. So don't subscribe to a parallel process where you try to conduct your board's business by email, text, social media, or what have you. Those can all erode public confidence in what you're doing, and they'll definitely create risks of noncompliance with the state law, okay? All right, let's talk a little bit about open records. This is kind of a new twist for those of you if you're new to public service. And the question I get sometimes is, hey, now that I'm a board member, if I send an email to a fellow board member about things that I don't like going on with the board, is that a public record? Well, the answer is generally yeah, it is, because the emails that you send or receive in your capacity as a public official under Colorado law are generally considered to be public records that any citizen can request and read. Yeah, there's a couple of exceptions not worth getting into here, right? But the main takeaway is I wouldn't, wearing your town board member hat, I wouldn't write an email saying anything I wouldn't want to say in a public meeting, right? That's just a good way of looking at it. And don't use email, right, to discuss, to have discussions that should occur in a public meeting. Be circumspect in your use of email as a town official, understanding that, one of the email's a great tool. I'm not, what do they call those? They call them a Luddite, anti-technology type person. Not a Luddite. It's a great tool, but recognize that once you hit send, what happens to that email next is outside of your control. So be circumspect in your use of email, make effective use of it, maybe to stay in touch with staff, to get packet materials sent out, those kinds of things, but be very circumspect in how you use email, otherwise to have discussions about the goings on of your board, okay? Anybody have any questions about open meetings compliance issues before I move on? Okay.
And if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Paul. I have a question about just meetings with, or not meetings, but discussions with citizens, just people who I, meet in the post office, at
Yeah.
a good 6 feet social distance. And they say, hey, Paul, I couldn't make the meeting last night. What happened?
Yeah.
What's my response?
Yeah, that's fine. There's
Okay.
no open meetings issue there. You know, the more pragmatic issue I see going on with that is when you give them that update, right? Make sure you're consistent with your reporting of what happened, and don't either fall behind or get ahead of your board. You know, I think the criticism that I hear when people call me, and oh, by the way, board members, elected officials, they call me, you know, and usually they're calling me because they've gotten frustrated about an issue and they now want to know what are their options. But what I see in that regard is sometimes like board members will express concerns about other board members getting ahead of the board, right? And I know that wasn't your question, but I just was kind of an opportune time to speak about that dynamic. You know, if a citizen comes to you and you say, hey, what's the board up to? And that citizen maybe has some interest in an issue before the board, make sure you don't overpromise or try to predict what your board's going to do, right? Or say, hey, I can get this taken care of, or I'm certain that's going to happen, right? Citizens need to, and most of them do, understand and appreciate that no one of you, right, really has the power for your board, but sometimes they'll misperceive that. So, but just having the fine, you know, hey, what happened last night? Absolutely fine, right? Well, we all know through, what's that, the telephone game? We all know that when that citizen tells another citizen, particularly if it's a hot topic, they tell another citizen who tells another, by the time it comes back to you, somebody says, hey, Paul said something, and you go, I never said that, right? But that's okay. That's okay, you know, well, everybody's got to deal with that in public or private sphere, right? But it does suggest this, if it's a real controversial topic, right? Rather than each of us kind of being put under the spotlight of having to, you know, verbally and individually let citizens know what happened, what's going on, maybe a good tool is to ask your staff support person, hey, could you throw something up on the web for citizens about what happened at last night's meeting, so that when they all call me and go, hey, what's going on with that very hot topic, you can say, oh, you know, we met last night, and in fact, staff has already some information about the current status on the town website. Or you can call Angie or Julia and they'll give you an update or something like that, right? Don't feel like you have to carry the burden, right, of being the public information officer for everything your board does.
Okay. Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, you bet. All right, let's, any other questions on that? Let's pivot a little bit to my suggestions for running good meetings. You know, other than get them done with it at a reasonable hour so you can all get home to, you know, your other lives. But we find that in the public sphere, right, there are expectations about how you run your meetings. So make sure you plan for, right, and lay the groundwork for orderly and productive meetings as public officials, right? Starting with your agenda, right? Make sure you give the agenda the time and attention it deserves. It can be frustrating to your fellow board members and to citizens who are interested in your board if we're adding things to the agenda the night of, right? It can be frustrating to staff if at the last minute we're asking to post something new on the agenda. There's actually legal risk issues involved in all of that, but more pragmatically, you know, make sure your board has a common understanding of when and how do we put things on the agenda, right? Are we all in agreement that we're going to commit to each other not to surprise one another by adding new things to the agenda the night of? And once we have our agenda, do we all agree with each other that we're going to follow the agenda, stick to the topics that we've identified for the discussion this evening, right? And not allow it to become a freewheeling discussion of other types of business that aren't on the agenda. Those are all important principles to doing your job well and effectively and having proper commitment to transparency, right? Having a good agenda, it helps build community trust. It lets staff know where we're going to spend effort and resources at that meeting, right? And it allows the board members to do the same, right? We shouldn't be responding to things at the last minute just because someone wants to bring up a new topic during the meeting. All right. We got through the agenda piece. Let's talk about, you know, in the meeting itself, local government is pretty informal. But we shouldn't abandon all formality, right? We can be informal, but you as the board should have some habits and expect others, right, to engage in habits that maintain some degree of formality, right? And also embrace a culture of civility, right? I've seen it firsthand. I've gone to night meetings among governments large and small for almost 30 years now. And I know for certain that if a board is incivil to itself, if the members of the board themselves are not civil to one another, that's contagious. And you're going to be the recipient of it sooner or later, right? So make sure that you understand a culture of civility flows from the top down. Emulate the kind of behaviors that you want to see, right, from your fellow board members and from staff and citizens and others. Do maintain a degree of formality. I don't know where, do you all meet there in the board chambers? Is that where most of the boards meet?
They do meet in the board chambers. We're all still on Zoom right now.
Yeah.
And also, Sam, if I could just stress that that also goes from communication between boards. If board members are at another board's meeting, that mutual respect and what you're talking about really applies there too.
Yeah, yeah, it's you know, the civility is important in all in public meetings, right? But particularly important among any of the public officials participating in the meeting. As you can see, I'm staying away from risk principles, but we've had claims, right, that are built upon public officials being uncivil to each other or to staff or to citizens. And so I need to be cognizant of those kinds of things. So the reason I asked about your meeting room is, you know, have a meeting set up that's conducive to a sense of, hey, this is a government body doing government business that has an important impact on the community and its citizens. So let's arrange the room the right way, right? Let's ask people to, when they want to talk, to be recognized. Maybe they come to a podium or they sit in a particular place when they're asked to speak. If you have a citizen comment period, I know this is true for the town board, you have a time limit listed on your agenda, right? If you're going to use time limits for public comment, make sure that you're consistent in enforcing them, right? It's at a minimum, it seems odd to people participating if you let someone go on and on for 5-10 minutes and then someone else gets up and all of a sudden you're strictly enforcing the 3-minute rule. That can actually get you into a First Amendment pickle under the law, but it also looks very bad. So be consistent if you're going to have time limits. And have a consistent sequence for how you do things. You know, maybe that's when the agenda item's called up, the chair or the presiding officer can ask, well, let's first get the staff's update on this issue. And then we'll ask questions of staff. Then we'll allow some public comment, and then we'll have some discussion amongst ourselves. If you're consistent in that, then people will come to understand, hey, this is how that board runs its meeting, and it's very predictable and it's efficient, right? Have a plan for handling disruptions, right? My best suggestion, if things get a little out of hand, or voices get raised, or citizens are yelling to the point where the meeting's being disrupted, from where you sit, the best tactic is to take a short recess. Let everybody cool down. You know, heaven help you if you're one of those municipalities that has these, but I've seen it happen with some of our members. The meeting gets so disrupted that it simply can't continue. Then your most effective way to deal with that is just to adjourn for the evening, right? Because no good's going to come of that situation in terms of the safety of the participants, right? Or getting public business done from a risk perspective. If people are yelling, yeah, that's unfortunate and it's uncivil, but we can't remove them from a public meeting just for raising their voice. So, you know, if it's a real disruptive environment, the best thing to do is just adjourn the meeting, okay? I don't know if I have anyone on the call who's the presiding officer or the chairperson of the Board Commission, but here's some suggestions for everyone, but in the presiding officer in particular. The presiding officer has a recognized role in maintaining order. but as critical in ensuring participation. If you're the chair or presiding officer, your job number one, right, is to facilitate discussion and participation among the members. The presiding officer is a role model in terms of maintaining an even temperament, acts affirmatively to control behavior, but not in a tit for tat or raise your voice, I raise my voice kind of way. The presiding officer keeps everybody focused on the agenda and on the topics at hand, and is also kind of the master of that strange art of knowing when something is ripe. You know, the presiding officers are particularly adept at sort of reading the room and thinking, okay, has everyone had a chance to talk? Is this now ripe for us to move this along by a vote or giving some direction to staff? So I commend to you, our presiding officers, to polish that particular artistic skill that you have, because it makes your board really look great, and it helps your board operate efficiently. You know, if we know that, hey, it's time to act, everybody's got a chance to speak. You know, at the other end of the spectrum, if we're just going around an issue for the fourth time around, that's probably not helpful to anyone either, right? So the presiding officer ensures participation, but doesn't steer outcomes. You know, I think your chairs for all your boards, they are voting members. For a lot of organizations, the presiding officers don't vote except in the case of a tie. And I only mention that to illustrate the point that the presiding officer's primary role is to ensure that everyone else at least is given the opportunity, right, to participate in the discussion. So if you're not the presiding officer, you recognize that sometimes you'll have the opportunity to exercise some of those same leadership qualities. And if it's a difficult meeting dynamic, doing so can help your board, right, succeed in dealing with those difficult situations. Like if the mayor has asked a person not to raise their voice a couple of times and then has turned the meeting over to you to make your comments, if the same person from the audience then yells something out, you can emulate the same behaviors by saying, hey, that's not how we as a board operate. Let's please be respectful. And so that shows everyone your habits of running a good meeting, okay? All right, the flip side of all this is I just want to point out some issues that I get enlisted to help with at CIRSA, where members call me and ask for techniques or suggestions. It's a wise board, right, that finds time for some self-examination if its meetings aren't going well, right? Don't just skip over those issues, right? Whatever the dynamic may be, make sure that you find the time as a board to talk about them, and don't let them become frustrations that are swirling under the water, right? But some examples of that, you know, are we frustrated as a board because people are talking on top of each other or across each other? Or is there some vibe that only a few members get the floor most of the time and other people are being kind of pushed out of the discussion? Are we feeling like we're frustratingly distracted because we're supposed to be having a discussion of public business, but we're all on our laptops or our phones or what have you, right? Whatever the dynamics are, right? If people think meetings aren't going well, get them on the table and work through them and see if you have common values around those issues and can agree upon some norms about, hey, all right, that's how we're going to do business, right? Like I once had a city council where the mayor, you know, observed and saw and heard from citizens, hey, you know, I'm frustrated because I stand up during public comment to speak to the council members and I see 4 or 5 people looking at their phones, or that seems to be the odd time when 2 or 3 members get up and leave the room, right? And the mayor was wise enough to say, you know, in a quiet moment, hey, council, we got an issue that we own as a council. And here's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing people think we're not paying attention, or that I'm hearing members saying that they're frustrated because of the dynamics going on. So find time to work on those, and that'll help you. With regard to developing norms around handling issues, right? Talk about how do we handle public comment periods. When someone stands up and says, hey, Chair, here's my comments. They go on for 90 seconds. And at the end they say, you know, and what's your board going to do about it? Do we answer citizen questions or do we just take the comments, right? CIRSA's suggestion is if it's public comment, treat it just as public comment, right? It's not really a great vehicle for back and forth with a member of the public. right? For a number of reasons. First, it may be the first time you're hearing about the issue. Second, there may be more information that needs to be collected before you can actually speak to the issue. Third, the citizen who's making the comment might be emotional enough to the point that whatever answer you give is going to be incomplete or unacceptable, right? So it's better perhaps just to take their comment under advisement and say, staff will get back to you, or we'll discuss this at a future meeting, right? Think about what your norms of conduct are as a board for how you give direction to your staff, right? And then lastly, you ought to talk about how do we handle inquiries outside of the meeting? Because I've seen that dynamic as well. Every board will have certain members who would like staff to work on some things in between the meetings. And I've seen that bubble up into a board issue. You ought to have, as an organization, an understanding of, well, how do I make a request to staff to gather some information? And is that something I'm allowed to do? How much time can I ask for? Who's supposed to make the request? How much in advance? That kind of thing. Those are all pieces that require some attention, okay? Lastly, I know that your ordinance, your new ordinance says that everybody needs to adopt some bylaws here. Have some good, simple, simple rules of procedure, right? About how you make motions, things that come up is who makes a motion? Does it have to be seconded? Can I amend a motion, right? Can I withdraw a motion? Just real simple things like that. You don't have to get bogged down in Robert's Rules of Order unless you really want to. But I'm not a huge fan of Robert's Rules of Order for local governments because it's an exceptionally complicated set of rules where what you really need is probably a half dozen simple approaches to the simple kinds of parliamentary things that come up, okay? All right, any suggestions on meeting stuff before I move on?
Sam, not a suggestion, but a comment back on public records. These cell phones, we need to be careful with cell phones because if we're communicating with individuals on certain circumstances, those can be actually used as public records. And
Yes.
then also if you're having like a group text thing going on, you need to be cautious that you're not violating open meeting laws.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. A text is still a public record in my opinion, and a text can still trigger meeting requirement. And I had earlier this year, just to illustrate perhaps with a little bit of humor, the problem. So these were actual land use applications where there's even a higher burden to comply with the transparency rules because people's property rights are at stake. But we had a couple of situations where the accusations were that the planning commissioners and the elected officials who were making the decision were, during the public hearing, texting each other and texting people in the audience about the application. Does that sound strange to you? Yeah, that sounds like a secret meeting within a public meeting, right? And if I were the applicant and it were my property rights that you were making a decision about, I'd be awfully surprised, right, to know that one of the commission members or one of the elected officials was getting direction and comments, right, from some citizen out there in the audience who was opposed to my application and sending them private text that said, vote no, or that's a bunch of BS, right? You can see how that's going to look real bad from a trust standpoint and also going to create legal problems. So yeah, stay away from the texting because it does create meeting issues as well, right? I don't mind, there's no problem with the text that somebody sends me a text right now and says, Sam, we can't hear you, unmute your mic, those kind of administrative things. But if you're doing that to speak about the substance, right, of a policy matter, then that's problematic. Okay. All right, any other thoughts on all that?
Sam, I think that's a good point that we should clarify what is perhaps more of a housekeeping issue or things that are not necessarily, for my group, the Planning Commission, not land use approvals or maybe quasi-judicial decisions, but more of a, I don't know what else to call it besides a housekeeping.
Yeah, I think housekeeping is a good way to look at it, right? The open meetings law, as I mentioned in my earlier slides, what it's concerned with is a window into public policy making. And that's where the real attention must be paid, right? Make sure that you're having discussions of policy matters only in that open public meeting, right? Email, texting might be an okay tool for a housekeeping matter. You know, maybe Julia sends everyone an email or text that's, and it sends it to all 5 members. Who's available for a special meeting next week? When all 5 of you reply and all 5 of you hit reply all, right? You may be thinking now, well, based on what Sam said, now we're violating the open meetings law. No, you know, that's not a discussion, right, of public business. The frustrating thing about the statute is it says you have to have a discussion of public business in a public meeting, but it doesn't define what public business is, right? So our Supreme Court has helped us in that regard. They've said that public business is any policy matter pending in front of your board, okay? So a routine administrative one, I'm not all that concerned about, and you can use it. But I think still a good habit for email is if you're just pushing something out, like if you as a board member say, oh, you know, I found this interesting article about wildfire mitigation. It might be good background information for the fellow members when we talk about the mitigation plan. You send that out by email, you're going to write, hey board, FYI, here's an interesting article from Wildfire Management magazine that you might find of interest. And then you're going to add something like, or we're going to understand, hey, to avoid open meetings or to ensure open meetings compliance, do not hit reply all to this email. We can talk about this at our next meeting, right? Let's not use this email as an invitation to start trading emails every which direction, right? With the 5 board members now talking about how that article, right, ought to influence the content of our mitigation plan. That would be the policy discussion. Does that help, Julia?
I think that's very helpful, yes.
Okay, anybody else on that one? I wish I had, you know, I wish I had 2 baskets and I could say, okay, not okay to every scenario we have, but it's just kind of one of those gray areas. Whereas, you know, be cautious. We have good common sense radars of when we're trending towards a policy discussion, and we all know that, hey, when we see that happening, go, no, we need to hold this discussion until our next meeting, right? Okay. All right, let's talk about ethics. Given time constraints, I just want to be respectful of your time, but I do want to touch on just a couple items regarding ethics. First, recognize that as elected and appointed officials, you're all subject to the Colorado Code of Ethics that sets ethical rules that all public officials and employees need to abide by. Doesn't matter whether you're elected or appointed or your board is advisory or not advisory, the state rules of conduct apply to everyone. Recognize also this risk factor that when it comes to matters of enforcement of the state ethics laws, that's not a local enforcement thing, right? That's not enforced by the town staff in terms of legal proceedings. It's the district attorneys, right, that enforce state ethics laws. So why do I mention that? To me, it just is a reminder to be conservative in matters of ethics and understand that egregious situations in the ethical sphere can expose you to potential personal, criminal, or civil liability, right? So understand that. Uh-oh, hopefully I didn't lose my ability to go forward. All right, given the time we have, I just want to mention a few ethics rules that you all need to be attuned to. And obviously the one that pops up the most is conflicts of interest, okay? So let's real quickly, as a reminder, refresh ourselves on what is a conflict of interest. And to keep it simple, right? You as a board member are in a conflict of interest situation, right? When there is a matter pending before your board, right? That's going to affect your own personal financial interest. Okay, so if your board's about to take action, and that includes just making a recommendation, right? If your board's going to take action or make a recommendation that would affect your own personal financial interest, you're in a conflict of interest situation. Okay, so what do we have to do when we have a conflict of interest? The first thing we have to do is disclose on the record at the meeting that we have a conflict of interest. So let's say the town board has a liquor license coming up. It's on the agenda, and the mayor says, and let's say I'm a board member and I'm a 50% owner of the business that wants this new liquor license. The mayor, I have to do that, calls that agenda item up. I need to right out of the chute say, Mayor, before you start your discussion of this liquor license, I need to make a disclosure. I have a conflict of interest because I am a half owner, right, of the business that's applying for this license. And then what do we have to do next? I'm going to recuse myself from the discussion and vote, right? Do you all leave the room then? When you have a conflict, step out of the discussion? Yeah, I would recommend it. The state law doesn't require it, but I think you ought to step away from the discussion entirely, right? So it's Mayor, I'm going to recuse myself from consideration of this liquor license application because I'm a half owner of the business that's applying for the license. I'm going to not vote and not participate in the discussion. I'll be stepping out of the room, and the clerk will come get me when we get done with that agenda item. So that's critically important. For advisory boards, maybe it doesn't come up as often, but it can. I'll give you an example. If you're working on the Parks and Trails master plan, and you have some interest in a business that does that kind of work. Let's say you have a firm that does landscaping, or one of their specialties is trailhead improvements, right? You're in a conflict of interest situation if that board is supposed to be recommending to the town board, right, an expenditure for a trailhead improvement, and your whole view is colored by the fact of, well, I think our recommendation ought to include a vendor, right? If you're lobbying that your firm, right, be a vendor for that work, that's a conflict of interest situation as well, right? So be attuned to that issue and make sure that you disclose your conflicts of interest and don't participate in a matter where you have a conflict of interest. Okay. Not that often, but yes.
Sam, we have a question in the chat here. This is Angie. It says, does GMF provide liability insurance for advisory members?
Yes, it does. It does. So through CIRSA, you have liability protection for elected and appointed officials. And that it covers you within the course and scope of your duties as a public official. Like all insurance, it's got exclusions, right? It doesn't protect you against what they call willful and wanton conduct, right? So if you're misusing your governmental authority to do the wrong thing for the wrong reasons in an effort to injure someone, then that's not going to be covered by your liability coverage, right? And it also doesn't cover you for criminal acts, right? The simple way of looking at that is I wasn't appointed to a town board to commit criminal misconduct. And so the board, the town has no obligation to protect you, and it follows then that the insurance doesn't cover criminal acts, that kind of thing. But yeah, do recognize that you do have protection. You actually have two sets of protection. There's governmental immunity. By and large, elected and appointed officials are immune from being sued as long as they're acting within the course and scope of their employment and not acting in a malicious or willful and wanton manner, right? And then there's insurance behind that that provides a defense, right? Protects you against potential claims for individual liability for things you do as a public official, but only as long as you're staying within the job, right, and not acting in a willful and wanton manner. Is that helpful? Did that answer the question?
I believe so. Lamar, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you're more than welcome to. I'm going to guess no
right.
comment is it?
Yep, yeah, I'm happy to, yeah, if there are follow-up questions, I'm available anytime if someone would like to call in.
No, it's fine. You answered it. Thank you.
Okay. Yep, very good. So right in the middle of the slide, that little link there is a 2-minute video that recorded. If you haven't seen enough of me yet tonight, yours truly is also in that video, but it's a 2-minute primer on what to do if you have a conflict of interest. Another important aspect of being a public official is understand the State Code of Ethics has a provision that says you shall not disclose or use any confidential information that you obtain as a public servant to further your own personal interest, okay? You probably don't come across confidential information all that often. Town board probably more than any of the other boards and commissions, right? But make sure you have a good understanding of what's confidential and what's not. If you have any questions about that, just ask your staff. Hey, is this document that we got, is that confidential? You know, if it's from your attorney, that's pretty clear. It's going to be stamped. But, you know, maybe once in a while you're going to get a background memo from staff that might actually qualify for the elected officials here, might qualify as work product. If you're on the Parks and Trails board, you know, I don't know if you'll ever get a confidential document like an appraisal or something like that. But if you do, you have any questions about how am I supposed to handle this document, just ask. And understand that the confidentiality belongs to your board as a board, right? And no one individual should be making decisions about, hey, I'm going to go ahead and release this confidential information. That's a no-no, right? You got to be on, that's a board decision that should be made as a board, okay? All right, finally, recognize there are gift rules that apply to you as public officials. I can boil it down into 2 sentences for you. Basically, we have a constitutional amendment in Colorado that says, do not accept any gifts of over $65 from any one person in any one year as a public official. Of course, that excludes family Christmas gifts and so on and so forth. Now, but there's a big caveat to that. The second half of the rule in my mind is don't accept any gift of any value if it's clear to a reasonable person that someone's giving you that gift to influence your vote as a public official or to reward you for a vote, right, that you've already cast. So this isn't going to come up all that often, right? More so potentially with the town board members, but sometimes, you know, somebody who wants you to cast your vote a certain way, for some odd reason, that's the day they invite you to lunch, right? That's the lunch you're going to decline, right? Or you're going to pay for yourself, right? So just be aware of that. It's kind of good common sense rules of if someone's offering you something, you got to step back and say, wait a second, does this have anything to do with me being a town board member? And if so, right, step back from it, right? Decline the gift and you'll be in a good spot then, okay? Any questions on that stuff? I take it there's not lavish, you know, fruit baskets showing up on your doorstep, that kind of thing, right? But just understand that these are very important rules, and you know, ethical transgressions make for great press. And the other thing I've learned over the years is that you know, sometimes you're going to be the subject of unreasonable allegations of unethical conduct, right? So a good defense to that is to have a good working familiarity with the ethical rules that do apply to you as an elected or appointed official, because then you're armed with the information that you need to understand what the expectations are of you. And you're in a good spot to respond when you have an unreasonable allegation, right? Once in a while you get this wild accusation of, hey, Mayor, you did that and it's completely unethical. If we know what the state code requires, we can respond and say, no, I fully understand, right, that I need to step away from official action when I have a financial interest. But let me remind you, I have absolutely no financial interest whatsoever in this matter. And that's an unfounded allegation. That's a great place to be, but we can only be there if we have a good working familiarity with the rules. So we have different trainings on those. We're happy to do those and happy to send more information. But that's all I'm going to do on ethics this evening, unless there are any final questions on that stuff. Okay. All right, suggestion 5, support the town structure. Recognize that everyone within the organization has a job description. We have already touched on that, right? And so we need to honor and abide by our job description. I've already covered some of these points, but a critical reason for doing this, in addition to high functioning within the organization, is for liability protection. As I mentioned a little while ago, you have protection from liability as long as you're within the course and scope of your employment and not acting willfully and wantonly, right? That phrase within the scope of employment may sound a little odd to you. You're thinking, hey, well, what do you mean employment? I'm just an appointed official or an elected official. That's just the language that's used in the law. And all it really means is everybody needs to understand and appreciate what their job description is. I'll give you a simple example. Right? Within our organizational structure, who writes tickets in the court? The marshal, right, or the police? And that means who doesn't? The town board members or any appointed official, right? Who hands out building permits? The building official. So who doesn't? Nobody else, right? Those are all simple examples. And from where you say, it's like, well, who's responsible for the Parks and Trails Master Plan? Ultimately, the town board. Who's responsible for raising the recommendation? The advisory board. And if everybody appreciates their role within the organization, it'll be just fine within that regard, okay? Look to your structural documents, right? Particularly if you're onboarding, brand new with your organization. I'm holding up this ordinance, which is ordinance number 2020-03. And in that's kind of the charter document that gives a description for each and every board and commission. That'll help everyone understand what their responsibilities are, right? If you're the fire board, hey, it's our responsibility is to work on and recommend to the Board of Trustees a fire mitigation plan, an egress plan. That's the limits of our responsibility, right? And if you go to the end of that document on pages 8 and 9, where there's a section called authority and responsibility, I've quoted a little bit here. It kind of, on the flip side of the coin, reminds everyone of certain responsibilities that aren't vested in board members. For example, no board or commission member has the authority to act on behalf of the town. In terms of no board member has the authority to approve a contract, right? Or to negotiate deals or to allocate or spend town funds. Those are all handled through different procedures. So understand those principles, and that'll keep you out of harm's way with regard to that. Okay? Couple more tips on supporting the town structure. Except for the town board of trustees, recognize that your board is advisory in nature. That's a very important role. But in that advisory capacity, do appreciate the fact that you're making recommendations on what you do. So don't try to predict the outcome of a board action, right? That can be disruptive to communications at a minimum, right? If you say, well, that's the recommendation and I'm sure the board will adopt it, that's getting ahead of things, right? You can report, I think as Paul mentioned earlier, you can report to your citizen, hey, at last night's meeting, we finalized our recommendation on the trails plan. It's going to go to the town board, and you can go to the town board meeting. Are they going to adopt it? Not sure. That kind of thing. Recognize that your role is a group role, as I mentioned earlier, and recognize, particularly in terms of reducing your liability risk, recognize that you do your job almost exclusively by meeting as a body, right, in a public meeting space, and you exercise your authority by voting in public meetings. To protect yourself from risk of personal liability, right, you don't want to be thinking in terms of I, right? If you didn't like what the board did, you don't want to be one of those outliers who says, well, the heck with you all, I'm going to go ahead and do this anyway. That's a huge red flag for you. Think in terms of we and not I. Okay. Adherence to the town's organizational structure is also critically important in the area of employee relations. Every board has some staff support, but recognize that except for the town board, where it has a few direct reports like the town administrator and the town attorney, you all as elected and appointed officials are not employee supervisors, right? Therefore, you don't want to get individually and improperly involved in personnel matters, and you don't want to be engaging in or facilitating activities that bypass the personnel chain of command within the organization, right? And I get it, sometimes maybe some employee within the town is going to approach you as a appointed official and say, hey, psst, can I talk to you about my supervisor? The answer to that question is no, right? Because you as an appointed official are not an employee supervisor within the chain of command. And believe me, you don't want to be conscripted into one of those issues or find yourself ahead of everyone else in one of those issues, particularly if it blows up into a claim or dispute. I've never had an elected or appointed official who's gotten ensnared in an employment matter that wasn't within their board's role ever say to me after we took their deposition, hey, that was a lot of fun. Let's do it again, right? So there are protections. You have the town administrator, right? Right? And other supervisors who do the heavy lifting on personnel matters, right? And limit your interactions with your staff to your meetings and follow the proper chain of command on how we give direction to staff, so on and so forth. If you hear something odd or out of the ordinary, or somebody wants to approach you about a personnel matter, you want to get that over to the town administrator or the town attorney. And that's an easy tool that I can lend to you. You can just tell them, no, my board and I don't get involved in personnel matters. So, we support our staff. We appreciate the work you do, but I don't really supervise in that area. So please go talk to your supervisor or the administrator or the attorney, okay? All right, just a couple more items here and then
Hey,
I'll
Sam.
Yeah.
I'm
hi.
sorry, this is Margaret.
Hi, Margaret.
Regarding what we just talked about here, what you just talked about, I
Yeah.
think it's really good for everyone to remember on our website, we have a kudos and concerns place that people can go to. And that's the best thing, I think, for us to recommend for people if they've got any type of concern or complaint or anything at all, so that they can go right there and type it in and it goes to the appropriate staff.
Yeah.
We don't get stuck answering for anything.
Right. Yeah, recognize, I'll just, because we deal with the risk and the claims, so I usually see stuff when it's, gotten to the bad end of the scenario, the spectrum. But recognize, if it's a situation where it's an individual elected or appointed official who's using that feature to complain about or give direction to, or do a de facto performance evaluation of some staff member, your administrator or your attorney is probably going to call you and remind you a little bit about role discipline, right? In terms of saying, look, I appreciate your concern, but since you as an appointed official don't have authority over this issue, right? I'll handle your concern from here on out. Don't take it upon yourself. And I think that's consistent with what you just said, Margaret, but I want to emphasize that, it's important to understand that backdrop, right? Because I've seen claims where, an insistent appointed official, just to be blunt about it, an insistent appointed official keeps pressing a town manager or a city manager to say, I want that person fired. Not a good place to be, right? Particularly for the potential personal exposure for that individual. So that's why I say, if it really gets to that bad of a situation, your manager or attorney will probably call you and say, look, that's not something you want to be doing, right?
And my thought also was for any people that come up to us anywhere and ask us, or start to tell us too.
Yeah, that's where that's at the better end of the spectrum. It's a great tool for and direct people to that. Just like my earlier example of directing people to your website, if you have information posted about current events, current developments on key issues, you can point them to that tool on the website. Hey, we have a tool where you can express a citizen concern, then it can be reviewed and vetted and resourced properly. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Yeah.
Just to support what you were bringing up there, Margaret, that link is right on the homepage on our website, Kudos and Concerns, down on the bottom left side there. And you're welcome to refer people there anytime.
Oh, great. All right. Another piece in supporting the structure of the organization is recognize that, while your board's made up of multiple individuals, each of whom might have different goals and priorities, you're still just, you're a single body. So resolve to speak with one voice to your support staff, right? Your ordinance, your recent ordinance also makes it clear that your chair is the conduit of communication between the board and the staff liaison, right? So don't have dynamics in your meetings like this. You go, chair says, well, let's give some direction to Angie on this issue. And then you go around the table and 5 people give 5 different directions or thoughts. Is that a good place to be? Nope. But you own that as a board. You got to keep working the issue so that you give some clear feedback to your staff. And then the other dynamic you have to avoid, particularly given this language, is that, you know, if you're a board member and something didn't go your way at the meeting, under your structure, you should not be reaching out to staff outside of the meeting, right, to give suggestions or direction on how staff ought to handle an issue. That needs to be sorted out at your board meeting, with your chair then serving as the conduit for communication with staff, okay? No matter how difficult or how many different points of view there are on your board about an issue, these things can all be sorted out. You just have to commit to one another that we're going to have as many discussions and gather as much information as we need to arrive at a decision as a board on that, right? Finally, recognize that as an advisory board, inherent in this ordinance that you passed is you all take the long view, the wide view, right? Your role is not with respect to day-to-day operations. It's with respect to the long-term time horizons, the vision of the community, the planning, that kind of thing, broad interest. And if you focus your energy there, that's where you'll have the most success, right? And that's where then you will naturally stay uninvolved from areas that are outside of your role, okay? My last suggestion is primarily for the Board of Trustees and the Planning Commission and the Board of Adjustment on some due process principles. I'm just going to touch very briefly on this, and I'll show you at the end of the presentation where you can go for more information on this issue. But recognize that while even the Board of Trustees, right, has many items that are policy items, that those 3 boards in particular sometimes are reviewing specific applications or cases. And that's where they're making recommendations or decisions that affect individual protected property rights. That typically includes decisions on a liquor license or a land use matter, a subdivision, a rezoning, so on and so forth. And for those types of decisions, the due process clause comes into play. Remember, the due process clause, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, right? At the local level, it's our responsibility to provide due process. So there are some due process rules of engagement that we have to follow, right? And I'm going to skip over this piece of it and just get to my tips on due process proceedings. All right, if you have one of those, make sure that you only consider that matter at the duly noticed public hearing, right? Do not consider liquor licensing or land use matters outside of the public hearing. Don't engage with the applicant or the proponents or the proponents or any interested party to that application outside of the hearing, right? Make sure you stay neutral. Don't make up your mind before the hearing. A due process hearing is all about, we're going to give notice to all the interested parties. We're then going to have a hearing where everyone can present their information and everyone can hear each other, right? We're going to do that all on the record at a board meeting. And then we're going to have a decision that's made or a recommendation that's made by a fair and neutral, right, decision maker, a judge. That's why we call it quasi-judicial. You're basically acting like judges, right? So make sure you remain neutral. Don't make up your mind before the hearing. Don't make any prejudicial pre-hearing statements, right? If you're a town board member and there's a controversial subdivision coming up, you don't want to be the person quoted in the paper the week before saying, well, I'll never vote for another subdivision in this town again, right? Because that's evidence that you're not going to judge their application fairly on its merits, right? Obviously, don't participate in a quasi-judicial process if you have a conflict of interest. And also, make sure you make your decision based on the criteria that apply. this is the part of the job when you're making these land use and property rights decisions where you have to make your decision based upon the town's existing standards, right? You have to set aside your personal preferences. If the board's having a liquor hearing and it's over, and the mayor says to everyone, hey, thank you, that was a great hearing, appreciate everyone's participation. How would the board like to proceed? And I jump up and say, Mayor, okay, I'll start the discussion. I'm just going to vote no on this liquor license because I don't drink. Is that a good start? Not a good start, right? Because my personal preferences, my personal views don't matter. I have to make a decision based on the criteria under state law that apply to liquor licensing. And in fact, right, whether or not I drink or don't drink is an irrelevant criteria. And that same thread finds its way through every type of application. If it's a rezoning request, there are specific rezoning criteria, such as compatibility with the master plan, compatible with the neighborhood. With a liquor license, there are criteria. For example, is it at least 500 feet from schools and so on, things like that. So you'll know what the criteria are. They'll be in your staff report. But make sure your discussions and your decision are solely centered around the criteria for that decision. Okay. The last tip I have in this regard, and then I'll move on, is just like a judicial proceeding, when you're acting as a quasi-judge, you have to stay away from having discussions with people about that application outside the hearing. I know that feels like a lonely part of the job, but it's a critical part of the job. Right? It's almost as simple as this. Let's say Mayor Pro Tem Peterson and I, just if I may borrow you for an example. Is that right, Margaret? So you and I are in a private civil dispute. Let's say I owe you money and you got tired of waiting around for me. So you decided to sue me, and our court hearing is tomorrow, right? The expectation that we each have of one another is that your expectation is I'm not on the phone with the judge the night before, right? Judge, how's it looking? You're going to rule for me? Let me tell you why you should rule for me. At the local level for these due process matters, it's the same concept. The person whose property rights you're affecting has the right and expectation, right, to a judge who is fair and neutral and not being lobbied outside of the hearing process, right? So that's what they call ex parte communications. That's what this slide's about. It's a critical duty to avoid ex parte discussions or outside the hearing discussions with any interested parties. The reason we're suggesting that is because the due process clause requires it, and we're trying to keep you in the game, right? We want you, your community needs you to be a decision maker, right? You don't want to be a person who has to recuse themselves because you've been involved in discussions, all manner of discussions about the application outside of the hearing, right? So embrace and respect the hearing process that you have, avoid those outside the hearing discussions, and you'll be just fine on that, okay? Lastly, to wrap this up, I'm going to kind of segue back into a tip for everyone, whether you're in a policy mode or a property rights decision-making mode. Recognize that, you know, discussing the matter at hand is critically important to how you do your job. And your citizens want to hear you debate, discuss, deliberate, right? At the end of the day, they got 5 appointed officials acting on their behalf, and they are eager to hear your perspectives and your views on the policy issues you're deciding, right? So good board discussions are always a good thing. If during those discussions you ever have a question, there are no silly questions, right? But have a good deliberation amongst your board before you make a recommendation or take action. When you go through that process of discussing and deliberating as a board, you know, that's where the group's going to formulate the basis for the decision it's about to make, particularly in those quasi-judicial matters. That's where the applicant, right, and the public's going to get an understanding of why you're either going to vote yes or no for this particular application, right? And then from a more legalistic standpoint, those hearings that you have, those are what we call on-the-record hearings. And if you're ever legally challenged, your hearing is what's reviewed. So we want you to have that discussion on the record, on tape about this is why I'm going to vote no or yes. This is why I think this application meets the standards. This is why I think this application doesn't meet the standards. So always discuss and deliberate. That'll serve you well. My last suggestion for you all as government officials is to use your power, your governmental power, right, wisely and humanely. Recognize that you set the tone for your entire municipal organization in terms of treatment of each other, employees, citizens, the business community. Appreciate that you're perceived as holding the most powerful positions in local government, right? Because you do, right? Make sure that you use courtesy, tact, and diplomacy in your interactions with the public, particularly in public settings, right? We've had over the years many claims here at CIRSA where the claim against you as a board or you as appointed officials kind of has a tinge that maybe somebody did something that kind of feels like an overreaction or retaliatory. And I know it's a tough job. You can be sitting up there sometimes during a very emotional debate and you just feel like people are just out to get you and they're making zinger comments. But you want to always make sure you use courtesy and tact and diplomacy, because things like First Amendment liability, right? And liability for retaliation, that all sticks to you, right? Not to the individuals who are making the outrageous comments. So use courtesy, tact, and diplomacy, and that will serve you well. Make sure that you commit to no surprises. Your board meeting ought not to have this surprise or gotcha kind of dynamic where new issues are coming up, where people are frustrated or surprised by what's going on. Make sure that you use your chair and as your liaison as a resource, and use your staff as a resource. Finally, commit always as a board to act as we, right? And not as I. We as a board would like to do this. We as a board suggest this. We as a board recommend this. That's how you build strong relationships amongst yourselves and with everyone else that you interact with, right? And commit yourself to the service of your board and commission and to doing great things for your community. So with that, I wanted to point out that we've got a couple other resources for you that you can find through CIRSA. The picture on the left-hand side of the screen is a handbook that we wrote called the Elected Officials Ethics, Liability, and Best Practices Handbook. The first link on that page is to a PDF copy. And it's a book that we republished last year with all sorts of information for elected officials, but it also translates for appointed officials as well, talking about ethics, liability risk to you. For those of you that are interested in the details of the insurance, there's a chapter on that. Also talks about social media use, open meetings use, all in a way that's intended to help you address the issues that you confront as elected and appointed officials, okay? And then for those of you that are quasi-judicial decision makers, the trustees, the planning commission members, the board of adjustment members, here this last link is to a 25-minute basic training that we've recorded for you all that is more information on how to do the job effectively on making decisions on liquor licensing, property rights, etc. Okay, so with that, there's a little information about CIRSA and then some information about me as well. So thank you all very, very much for your service on behalf of the town of Green Mountain Falls, and thanks for letting me join you virtually. Sorry I couldn't come down this time. I'd love to come visit again.
Sam, we'd love to have you. And I also, my mayor's having some connectivity issues, so she sent me one of those housekeeping messages, and she wants to thank you. And she just says thank you and apologizes for her connectivity challenges, but we really appreciate this and for you putting together all this stuff and taking the time to talk to us about it. So
thank you very much. Yep. If you have any questions, I can take them, or you can certainly pass them on to Angie, and we'll be happy to get you more information. CIRSA is always there as a resource, how much or as little as you like. So feel free to reach out, and it's right there at CIRSA.org, but just to show you where to go to, if you go to CIRSA.org, right across the top of the page, there's a ribbon there called Training and Prevention. And if you drop down on that menu, you'll see what's called an elected officials page. And right there is where we park all of our resources for elected and appointed officials for educational materials for you. So I hope you find those things of interest. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming.